vengeance inside, we let our fears declare a war. And with the blood that surely follows, we are guilty of so much more. So set aside your wounded ego and let your sunlight shine down through, so you can cast away the shadows and in your mind make something pure.
Human morality consists of virtues, vanities, and vices, each of these three categories containing four consistent core components that exist in differing forms throughout each category. These moral elements, as I call them, stem from the experiences and decisions of our ancestors, leading far back into prehistory. Understanding what makes a behavior moral allows one to adapt this understanding to apply to any action or conduct without the need to memorize complicated cultural mores. That is to say, when humanity understands the most fundamental concepts of morality, complicated legal and diplomatic traditions become redundant and more cumbersome than they are worth. So let's dive into this easy-to-understand system of ethical definition. And as always, please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Virtues represent traits or qualities considered morally good and foundational to a well-functioning society. We aspire to virtue, but total virtue is never something we can actually achieve. Yet in striving for it, we can manage to embrace the qualities more and more over time. At the level of virtue, the moral element of fire embodies the principle of valor. Valor is the courage to face danger and adversity, which includes those fears and doubts which prevent us from acting. In other words, valor aids in our fight against those thoughts which restrict action, thus promoting action. This is appropriate for the fire element, which symbolically can represent action and motivation. Embracing the virtue of the moral element of fire means insisting to yourself that you act when needed, that you pursue that which you know to be right, and that you recognize your own value as an individual in spite of anything others might say to bring your self-respect down. It is a shining beacon to guide you through the dark of uncertainty. Even if you don't know where you are or what to do, you can be certain that standing still will get you nowhere. The moral element of air, as expressed at the level of virtue, is the element of judgment. Like air, our thoughts are invisible yet can affect the world around us. Air is also an effective medium of sound waves, to which we owe our voices and ability to speak. To judge whether something is correct or incorrect, we must weigh an idea in our mind, seeking to understand both the good and the bad of it. This is something that almost requires communicating with others, as our human perspectives are limited in breadth. How you understand something may not be the same as how another person understands it. By communicating with others, sharing perspectives, and considering how those perspectives might integrate with your own life experiences, you can arrive at something closer to a universal truth. As it is represented at the level of virtue, the moral element of water embodies empathy. Water adapts to whatever you place in it, surrounds it. Water cools and soothes. When we empathize with another person, we seek to understand others by embracing their pains and experiences as our own and attempting to feel the pain and imagine ourselves in those experiences. This requires imagination, as otherwise we could not experience things we did not live through. Humans are social creatures. We want to know that others understand what we've been through, the traumas and the embarrassments and everything else. When there is little empathy to be found in a society, it begins to break down because nobody is willing to be vulnerable enough to try to imagine themselves in another person's pain. But until we do just that, things can only get worse. If we are to make a better world, there is no greater motivation than to know how badly others are suffering in the here and now. Lastly, the moral element of earth is integrity, and it represents the determination to continue to do what is right, even when it's very hard to do so. Where fire represents the inspiration to push forward and achieve good works, earth represents rigidity of moral function and a resistance to being moved from the decision to do what we know to be right. It's the ring of stones that keeps the bonfire in check and channels it for the benefit of its creator. Next up, we have the category of vanities. A vanity is self-indulgence. It's not inherently destructive on its own, and humans generally exist largely at this moral level at most times in our natural state. But when people become too comfortable existing at the moral level of vanity, they become morally complacent and society begins to degrade around them. It is only by actively pursuing virtue relatively often that we do not succumb to the darker potentials of vanity. Within the level of moral vanity, the element of fire represents pride. The popular saying goes, pride comes before the fall, and this is entirely true. However, it should also be recognized that pride is necessary for self-motivation. It is an appreciation of one's own accomplishments and a recognition of one's capabilities. But left unchecked, pride can make one arrogant, callous and selfish. The moral element of air is expressed at the level of vanity as ignorance. Humans cannot know everything, but we can choose to ask questions and to try to understand. To be ignorant of some information or experience we've never had even a related exposure to is merely to be human. But to choose ignorance over understanding is where this vanity becomes a problem. To choose to be ignorant of the underlying philosophies and mechanisms of astrology, for example, does not prevent many from nevertheless forming firm opinions about it. They know nothing of aspects or houses or interpretation, yet they choose to believe they know enough to criticize the subject and those who study it. Similarly, those who adhere to the flat earth ideology are ignorant of many basic astronomical and geophysical principles most of us are taught as early as elementary school, yet they believe they are more qualified in their ignorance to answer questions of the cosmos than those who understand such concepts at a fundamental level. When people choose ignorance over understanding, our millennia of collected knowledge become useless to them and human society begins to break down as people withdraw from being functioning participants. Representing apathy at the moral level of vanity, the element of water becomes like ice. It is made inflexible and unyielding. When humans are not provided the warmth of positive human interaction, our emotional state becomes void of empathy and we enter a state of mind in which it is easy to brush off and ignore the suffering of not only others but ourselves as well. This state of mind is the natural default when you self-isolate from others, and it leads to a very dull, uninspired lifestyle if it is permitted to persist. At its worst, apathy can lead to crimes like theft and murder or even suicidal thoughts, as one begins to not even care what will happen to themselves. The only way we can prevent apathy from destroying ourselves and those we care for is by surrounding ourselves with the vitalizing forces of those who show empathy for us, melting the ice of our apathy. It cannot be overstated how dangerous apathy can become if it is permitted to freeze over your heart. And yet, humans cannot exist in a state of constant empathy. Those who try always find themselves emotionally overwhelmed. As with most things, one has to learn to balance their empathy and their apathy to achieve emotional harmony. Finally, indulgence is the representation of the moral element of earth at the level of vanity. It is the pursuit of pleasure. Pleasure is not an innately negative thing and it can motivate us to achieve great things. But when we indulge our sense of pleasure too much, we risk being sucked into a mire that dictates our every action with the pursuit of it. Drugs, sex, delicious food, soft bed covers and good rest are all enjoyable and desirable things. But when we allow our integrity to falter, these pursuits become an obsession that can lead to ruin and decline in the breakdown of human society. The last category or level of morality, the lowest form, is that of vice. In vices, we find the darkest expressions of human nature. Vices are typically driven by fear, of violence, of duplicity, of negative emotions, of enslavement. And while vices are all negative and destructive, they are not always unwarranted. Leading this querulous quartet is wrath, which represents the moral element of fire at the level of vice. When we engage in wrathful conduct, it is a direct response to some form of harm, and it is the desire to inflict harm on others to prevent further harm from being inflicted upon us. Now when people think of harm, many tend to imagine any harm justifies wrath. If someone cuts them off on the highway, it doesn't matter that the other person didn't see them or maybe even had the right of way, they still feel harmed. If someone is a million miles away from their mind in line at the bank, they're harming those in line behind them by not moving the line forward toward the teller. Did that guy at the gym just look at that woman working out across the room? He's committing harm too. In truth, most things that people consider harmful are not, upon closer examination, harmful at all. True harm is a lasting damage. Either permanent or long-term. If someone's limb is broken or their low-income home destroyed, these are actual harms. They cannot easily be recovered from. But harsh words, hurt feelings and bad memories are all things that can be overcome rather easily if one makes the conscious decision to do so. Which is not to say that such things are easily overcome, but they can be with proper understanding and effort. Destruction, however, is quite permanent. When we choose to respond wrathfully to situations, it is best to ensure that we only do so under circumstances that will almost certainly lead to death or permanent debilitation. For anything less, there are better, safer, more solution-oriented choices to be made. When looking at the element of air through the low moral level of vice, we see it as deceit. It is obvious to most that lying is bad, yet everyone these days does it to one extent or another. This is not an excuse for the behavior but an acknowledgement that it exists everywhere we look. People can lie as easily as they breathe, rendering deceit one of the easiest vices to fall into. It is because of the vice of deceit that the virtue of judgment becomes such a necessity. Yet there are justifications for engaging in the vice that, while still destructive in the long run, can nevertheless offer short-term solutions. For example, let's say someone shows up to your door and asks for your mother by name. But the person is covered in tattoos and has a shaved head. You might believe the person has harmful intentions toward your mother and lie that no such person lives at this address. The intention was good, but perhaps later you discover it was a relative you never met who knew your mother when he was a child and is now dying of cancer and wanted to say his last goodbye. In lying, you deprive two different people of closure they might otherwise have gained. Conversely, however, you might lie to allow a friend or family member to escape in the event of a home invasion, simultaneously saving their life and potentially also your own. Deceit usually has a negative effect when used, often on the relationships we share with others, so understanding is always preferable to deceit whenever possible. Delusion is represented by the vice of the moral element of water. It is an emotional cloud that obscures our vision from potentials and makes it impossible to make good choices. When we give in to despair or fear or sadness or anger, we blind ourselves to the truths around us that we might otherwise understand. Bad choices lead to bad outcomes, making delusion possibly the most pernicious vice of all, as it can act as the motivation for all other vices. Sometimes we are so affected by an event that our minds enter a default state of delusion, where we are made to believe things that are untrue out of sheer survivalist desperation. This is a very human response to trauma. But while delusion may shield us from the harsh truths we were unprepared for when that trauma struck, remaining delusional can only cause harm to ourselves and those around us. At some point, we have to make the conscious decision to rise out of the vice of delusion and reach for virtue. And to wrap up these 12 morals, we have domination, which is represented by the element of earth at the moral level of vice. Domination is the exertion of strength or force limitation over the individual wills of others. In dominating others, we operate under the assumption that circumstances would be improved if we were making decisions for those we dominate. Sometimes this is true, as in the case of pets or children, who lack the capability to make better decisions on their own. But when it comes to those we would consider peers if not for our opinions of them, domination only breeds resentment and potential retaliation. In the case of criminal group leaders and government officials, who bear much in common with one another, they impose their misguided sense of order upon those they preside over by way of implied or actual violence, as well as by kidnapping and detaining those who act in disregard of their dictates. Sometimes this can be justified, such as when a gang leader or a politician attempt to have someone who is causing harm in their community detained. But it is always taken too far by institutions because those who operate within them have elected to defer their individual decision-making to those higher in their chains of command, who almost always are drawn to power because it affords them a shield from the consequences of their viceful desires. This creates an environment of unaccountability, where everyone points to some law or rule as the reason for their destructive and immoral conduct and nothing is ever done to improve conditions. While gangs and mafias erode their communities explicitly through unlawful domination, governments and the politicians, judges and police who run them erode their communities through implicit domination, locking away criminals whose conditions are clearly inspired by absent human connection and empathy, knowingly locking non-confrontational people into tiny concrete cells with violent offenders for years or even decades at a time to punish them with psychological tortures and deprivation of meaningful human contact in an effort to break them, and many worse forms of domination. When an individual is released, or finds their own way out of their enslavement, they are frequently rendered bitter, callous and vengeful for their mistreatment. They are thereafter often made a much larger threat to their communities than they were beforehand, necessitating further domination by their oppressors. Which is ideal for the dominators, since they often find greater financial success the more people they dominate in this fashion. That is to say, their abuses are financially and socially incentivized in the pursuit of dictatorial order. The antidote to domination is liberty, meaningful connection, and understanding. When we refuse to reach for virtue, we are reduced to wallow in vice when faced with adversity. And the same is true at a personal level as opposed to a larger sociological scope. When we make no effort to educate our children and pets properly and give them a solid recognition of boundaries and philosophies at their developing ages, we resort to dominance over them and the inevitable outcome is rebellion and conflict. Sometimes domination is the only way, but even then we can still make the conscious decision to engage those we dominate and try to build connection and understanding between us. Perhaps such individuals will never improve, but more likely than not, nobody has ever made a genuine and consistent effort to try. This concludes the in-depth examination of the moral structure. Now let's take a quick look at why morals exist in the first place. There are those among religions, in particular Christians, who are taught that morality comes from their God and no other God nor experience of humankind. As cults tend to do, it's an effort to claim ownership over people's decisions. That is to say, they are implicitly claiming that if you are not a member of their cult, you are inherently incapable of making moral decisions. For anyone who has seen pastors and priests marched out of their churches in handcuffs for abusing children, this must seem a particularly ironic take. But of course, cults maintain their grip on the minds of their members by discouraging them from thinking independently of approved cult doctrines through means of soft social coercion and the threat of excommunication from people who have often been friends or family for years or more. So to claim that morality comes from the Christian God alone is to say that nobody else is capable of morality. Not Buddhists, not Hindus, and most certainly not those religiously profane rational moralists like myself who prefer autonomy and personal accountability to blind deference to some form of appointed authority. But morality does not come from any supernatural source. It comes from the experiences of everyday men and women, who lived through deeply traumatic experiences and yet still made the conscious decision to try to understand what happened to them, why it happened, and how they could try to make things better for everyone else around them by recognizing the motivations of other human beings and establishing rules for others to follow so that what happened to them would not happen to others so long as their rules were observed. Those rules often become radicalized the further they get from simply don't kill people, don't steal their shit, don't lie and try not to hurt people's feelings, and as people lose track of the purpose of a moral foundation. But the fact remains that morals exist for a reason, because someone saw that people were being hurt and, having been hurt themselves, wanted to try to reduce the hurting being done. Nobody owns morality. You cannot possess an idea, you either have it or you do not, and it transmits to others the moment it is spoken of. Anyone who believes their institution is the sole reason morality exists needs to pull their heads out of their butts and rejoin the rest of us so they can see that acts of kindness and consideration happen every day, all around us, and sometimes even in the places we least expect to find them. None of us are required to conduct ourselves morally, but when we make the effort to understand why we do what we do and improve our moral alignments, we run the dangerous risk of making the world a better place for all of us, and there are some folks in positions of authority who would rather not see that day come. So be a rebel. Be moral. Save the world.
Thank you so much for watching. Any corrections or additional insights I may have to add can be read in the video's description. Your likes, subscriptions, sharing and thoughts in the comment section can go a long way to helping my channel and my message of a better future reach more minds. I upload new videos every Saturday, so please check back each week. And remember, we always have a choice and we can choose to make better choices. Thanks again, and let's rise together into this new age.